The machinery of listening runs in the background of every conversation you have, including the ones you have with yourself. This is what happens. When I was 10, my mother woke me up one day to tell me my father had had a heart attack and was in the hospital. Not knowing what a heart attack was, I responded with, "Does that mean we're not going on holiday?" I once asked my domestic worker if she had seen a particular T-shirt of mine. The next few times she came to work, she was very reserved. Eventually, I asked her what was going on. She said I'd accused her of stealing my T-shirt. Here's another one. I recently presented a webinar and someone asked a tricky question. I was caught off guard and I answered it very badly because I thought they were trying to trick me. When I listened again later and reflected on it, I realized they weren't. It was an honest question. In this episode, I'll show you what's really going on when you listen and how when you change your listening, will be a phrase we'll become familiar with, for a subject, you change your perception and your reality. And I promise this is more than just active listening or anything else you've ever heard about listening. This is What to Believe, where we investigate the bug in the human operating system, the one that makes it hard for us to face the truth about ourselves and has us chasing things out there that are neither real nor true. If you've been with me since the start, you'll have heard me talk about language as a technology, and then about giving your word, like drawing a line in the sand, and then the stories we tell instead of dealing with the facts when we deviate from that given word. And today we'll broaden that landscape one last time in this run of 4 episodes by turning it around to look instead of what comes out of you to what goes in, what comes in. In other words, instead of how you speak, how you listen. And, to jump the gun a little bit, how you speak from how you listen. And by the way, I'm drawing from a field called linguistic ontology, which has been developed into a modality called ontological coaching. I've developed my own version of that called effective inquiry, which is what we're doing today. So let's get into it. Hearing is the simple perception of a sound. We hear a sound arriving, and it's the simple sound. So when you hear a voice singing in a foreign language, a language you don't speak, for example, the voice kind of becomes just an instrument, and you feel the mood of the melody, and you're listening to instruments. But even then, we're starting to look at, what does this mean for me? Does this remind me of something? Is it meaningful for me in some way? Does it evoke some feeling and that it has meaning for me? And that's the difference between hearing and listening. Listening is hearing the sound plus the added meaning that we give to it. In fact, if there is no meaning, we'll probably project a meaning into it. Like sometimes people listen to white noise and then they can hear, oh, it sounds like rain falling. So we actually make meaning out of something if it isn't there. We imagine stuff, we project it onto that. And that can happen in particular when, let's say, you have construction noise in your area. I had it recently, someone was cutting down a tree and I was like, what does this mean? You know, are they ruining the neighborhood, or there's construction in our complex? And then, like, what's that person doing? And so you go to find out. And when you can see what they're doing, then you're able to make meaning from it. You can give it language. And then you can hopefully calm down and relax and put it into context. Or you might get upset because they're doing something they're not supposed to. And there goes the neighborhood kind of thing. But it's always about how it impacts me. What meaning does it have for me? And so the same as we're constantly scanning a room for our name unconsciously without realizing it. We only realize it when someone says our name. We're also scanning our environment for what's going on and what does it mean for me. And how do we find out what it means for me? Well, usually we have to ask. If I'm hearing that construction noise and I go there and I see stuff happening, I would need to find out why. I'd need to go and find the owner and ask them, like, well, what's the reason for this? You know, you're tearing down that half of the house. Does this mean, you know, you're just destroying the building? Or are you going to rebuild? What are you putting in its place? All that requires conversations. So we're back to language again. But the important point here is to recognize that listening is about the hearing plus the meaning. So it involves interpretation. So listening is really an interpretation process that we have going on internally. And so we can get this distinction about listening. We can say we're listening to, so I'm listening to a sound. But then what's more important is what I'm listening for. I'm listening for something. I'm listening for what? My name. I'm listening for, does it concern me? I'm listening for the impact it has on me. And we're doing this all the time, scanning our environment, listening for the impact that it has on me. How does it land and affect me? In other words, we're listening for our concerns, or we're listening from our concerns. So my concerns form the background of my reality, everything that concerns me, what matters most to me, your values, your needs, your commitments, your quiet fears, all those things that concern you. And we don't really hear the words that people say. We hear how their words impact on our concerns. So let's say you're leading a business and you have this investment that you want to announce and you're all proud of it and you have big fanfare and you announce it and it lands flat and the room is just quiet and everybody's like, okay. And you're like, well, what did I miss? And then they're like, well, does that mean we're not getting a bonus this year? People are listening for their concerns. If we think of my example earlier, the lady who heard me asking about the t-shirt was concerned about whether I trusted her. And it landed on her concerns differently. As a homeowner, those sounds that I hear in the neighborhood land on my concerns for the value of my home. In a cocktail party, if my name is mentioned, they're landing on my concerns for my reputation. When I was a 10-year-old boy, my father's heart attack landed on my concern for having a holiday. Sounds pretty harsh, but anyway, that's how we are. And likewise, you might recognize this as well. When you're, say, a manager, you're giving feedback to somebody, or even with your partner or a child, you're giving feedback, and it triggers defensiveness, aggression. Well, they're not hearing your feedback in the way that you are intending it, perhaps. They're listening for, am I in trouble, if they're the person who works for you? Or they're trying to control me if they're a teenager. So we can probably say that you've almost never heard what someone said to you. You only heard what it meant for you. You were listening for how it impacts your concerns. And the gap between those two is where most of the trouble in relationships lives. And all of life is about relationship. And all of relationship is about communication. And so this is tremendously important and impacts us all day, every day in such a significant way. And if we look at our social and political climate and the polarization we experience, and we look at it from this, the receiving end, we see that we don't listen to the other side. We listen for the other side. We listen for the enemy. We listen for the dog whistle, for the proof that they're as bad as we decided. And guess what? When you listen for an enemy, when you listen for those negative impacts, you find one every single time. Social media has industrialized this. It's turned into a machine for making everything land as a provocation because we arrive already listening for one. The context we listen from does the work. Doesn't matter what people say. And this goes both ways. It doesn't matter which side of the coin you're on, left or right. Everybody is doing the same thing, listening from their position, from their concerns, and finding exactly what they're listening for. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but some people, sometimes you get a person and nothing you ever say to them is good enough. They're kind of a hostile listener, and we can never satisfy them. I once worked with a guy, and he was more senior in the organization than me, and it was like he had it in for me. I would find myself lying awake at 4 a.m., trying to craft that email response to him that would land without him aggressively accusing me of being critical or insensitive or whatever it was that he was accusing me of. And there was no wording I could ever find that could evade his criticism. I could always see the angle that he would take on it. Every single phrasing. And eventually we came to almost physical blows, and I left the organization, and I heard later that others had the same problem, and eventually realized that it was not me who was the problem. I mean, I'm a professional communicator. I would know how to communicate. My whole practice is teaching people how to communicate effectively, and yet here I was being accused of that. So either I was getting something very wrong, or I was landing on a listening context that was predetermined. And I voted for the latter, and others eventually agreed with me after they saw it happen again and again with other people. My point here is that I've experienced that firsthand, where nothing you say for a particular person or into a particular context is good enough. And we can see that our political context is very much like that. No matter what you say to the other side, the listening context is predetermined, and you cannot land the point. They are always listening from their concerns through that filter and hearing exactly what they want to hear. And so this example shows our listening is a construct. It's not a verdict. So when things don't go your way, when you're not landing your point, it's not about the truth anymore. It's about how you and the other person are listening. Another example I could give, that has more personal impact is as a gig worker and a startup founder and a content creator. I've been selling myself one way or another my whole adult life. And it took me years to realize that when someone doesn't get back to you or when people unsubscribe, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you or your product or your content. It's often unknown. There's an unknown reason. There's something you can't make the assumption, but your listening, your automatic listening is always, there must be something wrong with me. What do I need to fix? And it took me years to recognize that and get over that. Even with this awareness and with this training, still your listening grabs you. It impacts you deeply. So what this means is that listening is a structure, we could call it a context. And because it's a context, it's something that we can work with. And it's very powerful if we work with things at that level. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at something like a virus. So not everybody gets sick or gets sick in the same way when a virus is present. So I might be in an airplane and get breathe in the same germs as somebody else, and I don't get sick at all, or I get completely different symptoms. So what is the reason for that? So my immune system is a context into which that virus lands, and it responds accordingly. So if I have a healthy immune system, then the virus can't take in that context. To turn that on its head, if we want to create healing, so let's say you cut yourself and you want to heal, you don't do the healing, the actual healing, you provide the context. So the hygienic context, you put a plaster on it. You create a context and then healing happens by itself. You want to grow a plant, you put it into a pot, you put it in the right light, you're providing the context, and then the growing happens by itself. So we can see that a shift in context, if a plant is dying and you move it to a different context, or something is not healing and you change the context, then things get better, things grow. And the listening from our concerns is a context for us, for the way we live our lives, for what we select from our environment and how we approach and feel about life. Let me show you. Let's say you're dragging along, miserable in your circumstances, same job, same bills, and you're really miserable about life. Why? Because you don't see any prospect for the future. You don't see it changing. It's just the same old gray day again and again. Then suddenly you meet someone. You fall in love. What happens? Instantly, the sky is beautiful. You're celebrating in the rain. You feel alive and energized. Why? Because your listening for your future has changed. Suddenly it looks bright. You're going to have fun with this person. You're going to do all of these things. Or you get offered a job. Or you book a holiday. And the whole world suddenly seems different. Guess what? Your circumstances have not changed. Only your listening. What you're listening for. How it impacts your concerns. My concerns are about the state of my life. And this thing lands in there and suddenly everything changes. So that's how broad our listening is and how powerful it is as a context. And so when you're receiving communication, you are receiving that into a context defined by your own listening, what you're listening for, based on your concerns. So we can see that this applies at a personal level, our own listening for our future. If somebody had to come and say something, encourage me or say something positive, and my context is all, oh, well, it won't make a difference, they're not going to understand why they're not getting through to me because my listening context is negative. I don't see my concerns being addressed by anything at all. And so nothing you say is going to make a difference. Whereas if I shift that context into maybe there is a possibility, and yes, we can do that deliberately, so I can change my listening for the future. Maybe it isn't all so bad. So I shift that context. Let me listen for opportunities. Let me listen for something else. Then I can do that deliberately. Falling in love does it spontaneously. It's not something I can control. It just emerges out of my environment. But I also have a degree of conscious control over this, where I can choose to listen differently. You can choose to listen to your partner differently. I choose to listen to them as someone who is responsible, interesting, engaged in their own life, trying their best, as against someone who is lazy, someone who is irresponsible. If I have that as the listening, nothing they say will make a difference. And then they wonder why they can't get through to me, and we're stuck. And I'm being right that my listening is right. And so we go around. And I'm sure that you experience that with other people as well. So coaching is a context, is a listening context. When you coach somebody, you can't coach them unless your listening context is right. So as a coach, you go into this with the listening that this person is capable and can achieve anything that they set their mind to. If you're not listening from that perspective, you can't coach somebody because you get stuck with the same problem in the same mindset that they are. So when you are coaching, you are shifting your listening for the person. And you're also making sure that it's not about you, not about your concerns. So as a coach, it would be clear to be saying, this is not about me trying to perform. This is about me caring for the other person. So we're consciously listening for our own listening. And that's really what coaching is. So we can take a little bit of that coaching element, and that's really what effective inquiry is how can you take elements of ontological coaching and apply this in your own daily life? So you can start to do this for your partners, for people on the other side of the political spectrum. Can I listen for this person having a valid point of view instead of listening for where they are prejudiced, listening for where they are communist, or whatever I've already decided is the dog whistle for the other side? And the same when you are speaking to someone else. When you speak to somebody else, you're speaking into their context. And your speaking is only any good if it lands the way you meant it. When we're in story, for example, we covered that in episode 10, we're not aware of how it's landing. We're not present to the other person. We're wrapped up in our story and we're just rambling on. And they're having their own thoughts and it's landing not quite the way we intended. So we want to be aware of how is the other person receiving what I'm saying? What is their context? What are their assumptions? This would involve things like stopping to check, asking if they're getting you, asking what they're understanding from you, making it a two-way conversation and checking what they're getting. We use that word, getting. Are they getting you? In other words, when someone is getting you, it means they're receiving and interpreting exactly what you intend to speak. It's landing correctly. It doesn't mean they have to agree with you, but they're understanding your intention behind what you're saying. And it's landing accurately. So this involves being present to the other person, being present to their listening, and our listening gets revealed through our speaking. So what the other person says to you, the example of me saying, does that mean we're not going on holiday? There, my listening is revealed by that. The domestic worker being quiet, something in her listening is revealed. What she's listening for is, do I trust her? And so the listening gets revealed through what we say. So we can say we speak from our listening, and my speaking reveals my listening, and I can pick up what other people are listening for by paying attention to their speaking. There's a lot more to this, and we'll cover this again in future episodes, going into it in some more detail, giving some more examples. And as always, at this point, I like to land this in terms of referencing other modalities and how they would treat this. So if we take the example earlier of where I said I presented a webinar and someone asked a tricky question, I answered it badly because I thought they were trying to trick me. Well, that triggered something very deep in me that had happened many years ago that I thought I had overcome and haven't encountered for many, many years. And then suddenly I was caught off guard and I realized these things, we never really completely over them. I wasn't maybe feeling that confident that day. I was a little bit unprepared. And so it triggered me. It triggered something in me from way back. Now, a psychodynamic therapist would want to know what happened to me in childhood. An ontological coach would simply ask, what were you listening for? And that doesn't mean the therapy is wrong. It could happen in parallel. However, to address the issue, I could simply address my listening. And then it might reveal, oh, this is linked to something in my childhood. Maybe I need to go and address that in therapy, and I can do that in parallel, but I don't need to wait for that to take place before I can be effective and identify and shift my listening in the immediate context. So if I'm needing to be prepared to do a talk in 6 weeks' time, I can identify what I'm listening for and I can shift that. I don't need 10 years of therapy before I'm ready to do the talk. The therapy can embed the learning or deepen the understanding, maybe release some trauma, but it's not necessary to make the shift. Positive psychology also touches a corner of this in terms of explanatory style. So the lens that reads events as the world's against me or here's what's in my hands. It's the same idea, but a slightly narrower frame. I think you'll agree the listening frame is much broader and gives us a lot more to work with. Another reframing from positive psychology is going from I have to go to work today versus I get to go to work today or let them. All of those reframings. These are all examples of changing one's listening for a subject. And so there's an alignment there. I think you'll agree that the terminology of listening for the other person's listening and listening for our concerns, how something impacts my concerns, adds a layer of clarity and a distinction that is very useful. We can look at mindfulness, which is about being non-reactive, becoming receptive, equanimous, a still kind of pool that the world can land in without the whole surface erupting. Stoicism is about that as well, and assenting to what is real, what you can control. And that step of noticing how you receive information from the world is what here in effective inquiry we would call listening for your own listening. Seeing listening as a thing, as an operating structure, one that you can observe and work with. So here's what you can do going forward as an exercise. Pick a conversation that you're slightly dreading, and before you go into it, identify what your listening is for that person or that conversation. This person has it in for me. This person annoys me. This person is lazy. This person is irresponsible. And shift that listening to be a choose. I choose to listen for this person's being responsible. I choose to listen for this person's making an effort. And then come from that listening when you go into the meeting and see what changes in terms of what you hear and how suddenly they feel more heard and how much more constructive that conversation becomes, how much more willing they are to engage, how much more aligned your speaking and their listening becomes. And if you want to take it to another level, you could do this with yourself. What is your own listening for yourself? You could start playing with that game too and seeing how that comes out, the conversations you have with yourself. And so that closes the loop on these 4 episodes. We started with the unusual, often unrecognized fact that we live in a sea of language, and yet we never look at the water. Then we looked at a specific manifestation of that, your word, using your word to create your reality. Then we looked at story, the fiction we make up and mistake for reality when things don't go our way, when we don't do what we said. And now we've looked at listening. The context that all of life lands in is our listening. And each one of those is designed to create a new level of clarity and understanding through distinctions about reality, enabling us ultimately to deal with what's real and what matters. And once again, this isn't something to believe. It's a technology that you can use and test, and that will inevitably impact what you believe. And by using it, you'll get better at, you know it now, dealing with what's real and what matters. And that's not a place you arrive at once. It's a practice. I'll call it effective inquiry. And it's a practice that we're going to be circling through again and again from more angles with more examples until you start getting it operating in yourself. And not because I told you, but because you saw it. This is what to believe. If you're finding value in this, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. If something landed, not just made sense, but actually landed, share it with someone who you think could benefit. That's how this work spreads. You'll find a written companion on Substack under my name. And if you want to take it further, there are ways to work with me. The links are in the show notes. I'm Neil Bierbaum. Thank you for listening. See you next time.